In the spring of 1971, on a 1,120-acre dryland wheat farm 7 miles north of Jetmore in Hodgman County, Kansas, a 58-year-old widow named Vesta Halloran paid $416 in cash for a used 12-foot V-blade sweep undercutter from a retiring farmer named Orlin Stutzman over in Pawnee County. She paid it out of an old baking powder tin, hauled the blade home behind a 1964 Ford F250 with a flatbed and a borrowed gooseneck, 31 miles of section road, and pulled it into the open front machine shed her late husband Carl had framed in 1956, a pole shed 40 feet by 60 under a low galvanized roof, where the moldboard plow had sat shining and idle since the day she decided she would never pull it through her ground again. The men at the Jetmore Cafe laughed for an hour and 40 minutes when they heard what she meant to do, or rather, what she meant to stop doing. She meant to stop plowing. Not slow down, not plow shallow. Stop for good and leave the wheat stubble and the roots standing in the field through the fallow year the way her grandmother had farmed the dry steppe before she ever crossed the ocean. The men called it the lazy notion of a woman who had let grief get the better of her judgment. A clean plowed field was a serious man's field, they said, black, turned, swept of trash, ready. A field left in last year's stubble was a field gone to weeds, a field a woman had simply quit working. They were still saying it 6 years later, still laughing, some of them, right up until the dry year came, the spring of 1977, when the rain quit and the wind came up out of the southwest and would not lay down, and the bare plowed ground of Hodgman County lifted off the fields in brown clouds and drifted into the fence lines and buried the winter wheat alive. That spring, when the blowing dirt had stripped the topsoil off every clean-tilled section in 3 townships, the only ground in the county that lay still and held its moisture and grew a crop was the stubble-covered, mocked ground of the widow Vesta Halloran. The thing she meant to do was not her own idea. It was written down, and it had been written down for the better part of a century in a cracked tan leather field book that lay open on her kitchen table that first morning, its pages crowded with pencil and ink in 2 hands and 2 languages, a flattened head of wheat pressed between 2 of them. The book had belonged to her grandmother, Augusta Reinhardt, who had farmed dry wheat ground on the steppe above Saratov on the Volga before she ever saw Kansas, and who had brought across the ocean both a sack of hard turkey red seed and a head full of the only dry farming she knew. Vesta did not invent a method that spring. She remembered one, and she read it in her grandmother's hand the way other women read Scripture, quietly at the table before the men were awake to laugh. By the autumn of 1971, the agricultural orthodoxy of the Central High Plains had reached the cleanest expression of its 100-year arc. The orthodoxy was simple. The plow was civilization. The plow had broken the prairie and made it pay, and the cleaner and blacker a man turned his ground under, the more serious a farmer he was. You moldboard plowed your stubble down in the fall, worked the ground black through the fallow year, summer fallowed it bare and clean of every weed and every stalk, and above all, got the trash off the top, because trash was untidiness, and untidiness was a poor manager. The county's authority on the matter was a Jetmore wheat man named Dwight Forsythe, 61, who farmed 2,000 acres and chaired the local elevator board, and who said it plainly at the cafe counter, Vesta Halloran had let grief get the better of her judgment, and a wheat field was no place for a woman too tired to plow it. The clean, black summer fallow was a thing of pride and of cost. Dwight Forsythe burned diesel by the barrel, working his fallow ground black 5 and 6 times a season, disking, plowing, harrowing. But the fuel was the point. The more steel and diesel and borrowed money a man ran across the top of his soil, the more serious he was. A widow who left her stubble standing, who made 2 passes where he made 6, and let last year's straw lie on top like someone who couldn't be bothered, was by that arithmetic not a wheat farmer at all. She was a woman letting a good half-section go back to weeds alone on a place a careful neighbor could watch run down from the road. There was one line in the field book Vesta did not understand, and it troubled her more than the laughter did. Near the back, in her grandmother's hand, was the start of an entry dated 1921. Das Jahr, in dem wir verloren, the year we lost. And there the line stopped, and the rest of that page was gone, torn out clean along the gutter, and a brown scorch run up the stub as though the leaf had been held to a stove lid before it was pulled. The next surviving page picked up 2 seasons on as though nothing were missing. Augusta had never once spoken of a year they lost. Not in all the evenings Vesta had sat at her knee on this Kansas porch, hearing her talk of the Volga. What had they lost? Why the burn? Why the tear? Vesta set the question aside the way a careful woman sets aside a debt she means to pay later, and she went back to the part of the book she could still read. Vesta Halloran had been raised on a different consensus. She was born Vesta Reinhardt in 1913 in a limestone farmhouse 2 miles east of this one, and she had been raised hand to hand by a grandmother who did not believe in turning the ground black, because on the dry steppe she came from a turned field blew away, and a man learned that or starved. Augusta Reinhardt had come over from the Volga German colonies above Saratov in 1876, a girl of 12, with a sack of turkey red seed sewn into her coat lining, and the only dry farming she knew, the kind where the straw stayed on the ground to hold the snow and break the wind, where you tickled the surface and did not turn it, where you fallowed a year to bank the moisture, but you did it without bearing the dirt to the sky. She had farmed this hard Kansas ground for 50 years, the way she had farmed the steppe, and she had kept Vesta at her elbow through every seeding and every dry fallow she ever made. Vesta's husband, Carl Halloran, an Irish stock farmer's son from down the county, which is how the families came to be joined, had loved her and humored the old woman and quietly plowed black with the rest of the county for 30 years, because by the time he married Vesta in 1937, the tractor age had arrived, and the grandmother's trashy fallow looked like poverty, dressed up as wisdom. Carl died in August of 1969 of a heart attack that took him on the seat of his combine in the middle of cutting wheat, 59 years old, found by Vesta when the machine ran on past the end of the cut and stalled against the fence. He left her the 1,120 acres, a tired, plowed-out farm thinned in his last sick years, a $13,200 note at the Jetmore Bank he had taken to buy the combine, and no living children, because the one son they made had died at 20 in Korea in 1951, and they had never spoken of it after the second telegram. She buried Carl beside that son and beside her grandmother, and she was alone with the place. For a year after Carl died, Vesta farmed the ground the way he had, plowing it black and working it clean. The fall of 1970 was dry, and the wind came up in October across the bare-worked fallow, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched the topsoil of her own south section drift like brown smoke across the road and pile in the bar ditch, the finest, blackest, most fertile dirt she owned, walking off the place on the wind because there was nothing on top to hold it. She thought about the $13,200 note and the price of diesel climbing every season. She also understood that the clean plow road was getting more expensive faster than it was getting more sure. Every black pass burned fuel and burned moisture. Every turned field gave its dirt to the wind, and a dry, windy spring could take in a week what it had taken the prairie 10,000 years to build. A method that made 2 passes instead of 6 and left the straw to hold the ground was not the method of a lazy woman. Vesta had chosen the V-blade sweep on purpose, not by accident. It was a wide, flat undercutting blade that ran an inch or 2 below the surface and sheared the weed roots off clean while leaving the wheat stubble standing whole on top, mulching the trash into the surface instead of burying it. The stubble mulch method the dryland stations out west had been quietly proving for years. Orlin Stutzman had run his blade for a decade on sandy Pawnee County ground and sold it to her cheap because he was quitting. So her $416 bought not a lazy woman's excuse, but the one tool in the county built for exactly the thing she meant to do. She had read the principle in the field book, too. Augusta had farmed before there were any blades at all, with a duck-foot cultivator and a wood-toothed harrow, and had written beside the entry the rule the dry country taught: "Last die stoppin' steein', let the stubble stand." Vesta had matched her grandmother's rule to a tool she could actually buy in Kansas in 1971, and she had matched it well. That winter, she took the field book down from the parlor shelf where it had sat untouched since 1958, and she read it from the front, slowly, a finger under each German line, and she began to understand she had been farming against her own inheritance. What the book told her was a method, not a sentiment. Augusta had drawn it out, a field in cross-section with the wheat stubble standing on top like a stubbled beard, the roots holding the crumb of the soil together below, the dead straw breaking the force of the wind at the ground and catching the winter snow so it melded down into the profile instead of blowing off to the next county. Bare ground was a wound, Augusta had written in her plain step hand. Bare ground had nothing to hold it and nothing to feed it. So the wind took the dirt, and the sun baked the moisture out, and the rain ran off the crust and was lost. Ground kept under its own trash drank the rain and banked it. A field that held its moisture grew a crop in a dry year. A field that blew grew nothing and was poorer every year it blew. Nothing in it was laziness. All of it was bookkeeping, kept in inches of rain and tons of dirt. So Vesta did the quiet thing. She told no one. On the first Sunday of October 1971, she hitched the 12-foot blade behind Carl's John Deere 4020 and ran it once, flat and shallow, across her worked-out south section, cutting the volunteer weeds off below the crown and leaving the old wheat stubble standing whole on the surface behind her. And where the mold-board plow would have rolled the ground over black, she left it pale gold and bristled and unturned. She did not plow that fall, not 1 acre. She undercut the weeds, she let the stubble stand, and in the late fall she came back with a hoe drill that seeded straight down through the standing trash without burying it, and she drilled her hard red winter wheat into ground that had not been turned over in a year. Then she stood at the field edge with the book under her arm and watched the wind come across her stubble and slide over the top of it without lifting a grain of dirt, while 2 miles west, Dwight Forsythe's bare black fallow smoked in the same wind. Vesta wrote the date in the back of the book below her grandmother's hand and went in to her supper. Her nearest neighbor saw it from the section road that same Sunday. His name was Royal Forsythe, 63, Dwight Forsythe's older brother, a pressed shirt and clean resistal man who had wanted the Halloran half-section for 20 years because it squared his ground into one block. Royal slowed his truck on the gravel and watched a widow running a blade that left the trash standing where a Christian plow would have turned it under on ground she meant to seed without ever plowing it black. And he drove on to the cafe and told his brother, and by Tuesday the whole of Jetmore knew that Vesta Halloran had finally, as Dwight put it, quit farming and started letting it go. The mockery, when it came, wore the clothing of concern, and it came twice in ways that mattered. The first was at the Jetmore Co-op on a Saturday in November, where Vesta went to buy seed wheat and a barrel of diesel and found 4 men at the counter: Dwight Forsythe, Royal Forsythe, a wheat man named Laverne Tice, 54, and the co-op manager, Harold Coons. Laverne asked her, gentle as a man can be while cutting, whether she meant to harvest the weeds for hay or just admire them, since she'd plainly decided to grow a fine crop of them. The men laughed. Harold, totaling her seed, told her kindly that he would carry her account through to harvest, but that he hoped she had thought hard about drilling good seed wheat into a trashy, unplowed field where it would smother and rot and bring every cutworm in the county. She paid cash and thanked him and carried her own seed sacks to the truck. The second set piece was the Harvest Home Supper at Zion Lutheran in July of 1972, and it planted the thing that nearly ended her. The women of the parish were kind to her in the way people are kind to the bereaved and the foolish at once. Dwight's wife asked, across the long table, whether Vesta worried what Carl would have said about letting the home place go to stubble and weeds. The table went quiet. Vesta set down her fork. Carl, she said, would have asked me what my grandmother thought, and my grandmother wrote it down. Then she stood, carried her own plate to the wash sink, and washed her own dish, and the quiet behind her was the quiet of people deciding she was further gone than they had feared. She drove home and read the field book by lamplight until midnight, and she did not see the one line she most needed to see, because it sat on the page before the torn one, and she had been reading the page after. Royal Forsythe took it home to his wife. Her name was Matilda Forsythe, 60, a broad, plain woman in a flower-dusted house dress, who had buried her own husband's pride more than once. Royal told her at the kitchen table that Carl's widow had lost her mind and was going to lose the home place, and that when she did, he would buy it at the bank's price and make his ground square. Matilda put down her bread knife. Royal, she said, and she said his name the way you set a stone on a table. That woman buried a husband and a boy and the old grandmother on that place. She has farmed it alone for 2 years. You will drive over there and ask her what she is doing, like a man, and you will not sit at my table and parcel out her grave dirt. Royal went. He came on a Thursday evening in late August and met her at the field edge of the standing stubble section, and what he saw stopped him. The wheat was not smothered. It had come up clean and even and dark green, through the old straw, thicker than his own. The stubble between the rows holding the soil and catching what little moisture the summer gave. He bent and pushed his hand down into the ground between the rows and found it cool and damp, 2 knuckles down, while his own worked fallow that same evening was dry and hot to the depth of a spade. Royal stood up and told her, as concerned, that she would lose it all to disease and weeds and a hard wind before she ever cut it. Vesta answered him point by point in her grandmother's logic. The stubble that breaks the wind at the ground, the roots that hold the crumb, the trash that catches the snow and feeds the moisture down, the bare field that wounds and bleeds away its dirt and its rain. And she finished the way the book had taught her. I am telling you what I am doing, Royal, so that you do not have to ask me again. Royal took off his resistol and held it against his chest. I cannot stop you, he said. I cannot help you. I am going home. I will watch what happens. And he went home and watched. What happened first was that she nearly proved them all right. Vesta had read the method, but not the whole of its discipline, and in her first full year, she let the weeds get ahead of her. The book said a stubble field still had to be undercut clean each time the volunteer in the weeds greened up through the fallow, that you traded the plow's brute turning for a watchfulness, a timely, shallow pass, with the blade whenever the trash hit a flush of weeds, drinking the moisture you meant to bank. But Vesta, seeing how well the wheat stood and how the ground held, did the thing a careful person does with the tool that is working. She let it ride and trusted the stubble. Through a wet stretch in the spring of 1973, a heavy flush of cheat and kochia came up under the standing straw where she could not see it from the road, and it grew unchecked and drank the very moisture she had left the stubble to save, and by June her fallow ground was greener with weeds than with intention, robbed dry from below while it looked tidy from above. She found it on the morning of June 9th, 1973. The weeds in the fallow half had headed out thick and tall under the stubble, the soil beneath them pulled dry as bone where it should have been banking the spring rain, the moisture she had bragged on to Royal Forsyth, drunk away by a crop of cheat grass she had let grow because she was too proud to make one more pass. She stood at the field edge and felt the laughter of the whole county settle on her shoulders at once. Laverne Tice had asked whether she meant to harvest the weeds, and here was her answer, a half section of them. That fallow ground went into the next wheat year short of moisture, and the crop it grew came up thin and stunted across 40 acres, better than $900 of wheat she would not cut, and she had handed the cafe its proof. The lazy woman had let her ground go to weeds, exactly as Harold Coons had warned. She walked the field once slowly, then went in and sat at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands, and for the first time since Carl died she thought, plainly, that she might be the fool they said she was. Then she opened the field book, because the book was the only voice left that had ever told her the truth. She read the fallow pages again, line by line, and this time she read the page before the torn one, the page she had skipped, and there it was, in Augusta's hand, underlined twice. Die Stoppel hält den Boden, aber der Faule verliert ihn doch. The stubble holds the soil, but the lazy one loses it anyway. Leaving the stubble was not leaving the field alone. It was trading the plow's hard labor for a sharper, lighter watchfulness. The blade runs shallow and timely the moment the weeds stole the water, because trash on top without a clean undercut beneath was just a tidy roof over a robbed cellar. The method had never failed. Vesta had. She had kept the stubble and forgotten the discipline that made the stubble pay. She breathed, and she fixed it. That same week, she ran the V-blade across the weedy fallow at just the right shallow depth, shearing every weed off below the crown without burying the straw or turning the ground, and she set herself a rule she wrote in the book that night. Blade the fallow the day the weeds break green, not the day the field looks bad. From then on, she watched the stubble like a hawk and undercut it the moment a flush came, 2 or 3 light timely passes a year instead of the plow's 6 black ones, and the fallow banked its moisture the way the book promised. The damage stopped at 40 thin acres, and Vesta wrote the lesson in the back of the book under her grandmother's hand in English, so whoever came after her would not have to lose $900 to learn it. Keep the stubble, but keep the blade sharp and early. She had her protocol now. Undercut shallow, leave the trash standing, drill straight through it, watch the weeds and cut them timely, fallow without burying the dirt. The next wheat she cut off, rebuilt ground came in heavier and cleaner than any she had grown on plowed land, at 1/3 of the diesel, and the doubt settled out of her like dust, settling out of still air. If you have walked with Vesta Halloran this far into her story, stay with her, because the part that follows is the part the men at the Jetmore Cafe never saw coming, and it is the reason her name is still spoken in Hodgeman County. The years between 1973 and 1976 were the deep work years, and they were quiet ones. Vesta ran the stubble mulch system the right way every season, undercut shallow and timely, the straw always standing, the wheat drilled straight through the trash, the fallow watched and bladed early, and every year the ground held a little more moisture than the year before and grew a little heavier crop. She kept the book faithfully in her own hand, below her grandmother's, so it thickened by an entry a year. She brought a second worn-out quarter back under the system as the place steadied, and she settled into a steady rotation of wheat and fallow across the 1,120 acres, because that, the book told her, was the right balance for a woman and a dry country and one good blade. The numbers stacked up the way numbers do when a method is real. Through the dry, ordinary years, her stubble ground carried better than 2 inches more stored moisture in the profile at seeding than the bare fallow average across the county, and that 2 inches grew wheat when the rain came short. Her diesel bill ran 1/3 of what Dwight Forsythe burned working his ground black. She lost no topsoil to the wind in any fall, while her neighbors' bar ditches filled with the best of theirs. She paid Carl's $13,200 note down to nothing by the harvest of 1975 and burned the paper in the cook stove. She hired a hand for the busy seasons, a steady young man named Emmett Brower, 19, at $2.40 an hour, who learned to read the stubble and never once laughed. By 1976, her yields on the same dry ground ran 4 and 5 bushels an acre over the bare fallow neighbors in a normal year, and a Jetmore grain man named Curtis Lindell began grading her hard red winter wheat a notch above the run of the county. In the middle of those years, a letter came from a man named Dr. Reuben Falk, an associate professor of agronomy at Kansas State University over in Manhattan, who had heard from a county extension agent about a Hodgeman County dry land operation that plowed nothing, blew nothing, and out-yielded its bare fallow neighbors in dry years, and who asked whether he might come and study it. Vesta wrote back one word, yes, and Dr. Falk came in the spring of 1975 with a clipboard and 2 graduate students, and they pushed soil probes into her ground and into the worked fallow of 3 neighbors, and they weighed the stored moisture and counted the residue and ran the figures, and found her stubble ground holding nearly 2 inches more available water in the top 4 feet and losing a fraction of the soil to wind and runoff that the bare ground lost. Dr. Falk asked to publish it. Vesta said he could, on one condition. "Don't use my name," she said. "I have neighbors." So in the bulletin that came out in 1976, in a publication Vesta never read, the dryland stubble operation in Hodgman County appears only as Cooperator F. And still, the mockery did not stop. It only moved sideways. Dwight Forsythe allowed at the cafe that the Halloran woman had gotten lucky with a run of soft, kindly seasons, and that any field would do all right in a string of years the good Lord kept watered. The real test, he said, would come in a dry year, a true dry year with a wind behind it, when the rain quit and the southwest wind came up and sat and would not break, and they would all see who had been farming and who had been letting it go. He moved the goalposts the exact width of a season. Kindly year, he said in 1974, lucky year in 1975. Just been soft weather this decade in 1976. He was a proud man and not a cruel one, and the difference would matter later. But for years he taught the cafe to believe Vesta's holding moisture-banking ground proved nothing except that the weather had been gentle. The county half believed him, because it is easier to think a widow lucky than to think yourself wrong, and wrong on borrowed money and burned diesel for 30 years. So the mockery softened from ridicule into a kind of patient waiting. They were all waiting now, with Dwight year after year, for the one dry year that would finally prove the plow right. The method was never a single clever trick. It was a covering kept on the ground, season over season. Bare soil, Dr. Falk's probes had shown, gives up its moisture to the sun and its body to the wind. A clean plowed fallow field in a dry, windy spring can lose tons of topsoil to the air in a single afternoon and bake the rest of its moisture away under a sealed crust. Ground kept under standing stubble holds. The straw breaks the wind at the surface so the dirt does not lift. The roots hold the crumbs so the soil does not powder. The trash catches the snow and lets the rain soak instead of run. And a field that keeps its dirt and its water in a dry year grows a crop while the bare ground beside it grows a dust cloud. The cafe saw a trashy, weedy field and called it neglect. It was, in plain fact, the soundest, deepest watered, best anchored ground in the whole county, lying under a half-inch of the very stubble the clean men swept away. That winter she did the arithmetic of 6 years and set it down on a clean back page, because she was a woman who reads her own books. From the fall of 1971 through the harvest of 1976, her tillage cost, fuel, steel, and the hours on the tractor totaled less than a third of what Dwight Forsythe spent working his ground black, near $1,900 across 6 years against his better than $6,000. Her wheat had brought in better than $61,000 across those years and carried her taxes and her wages for Emmett. She had not lost a measurable ton of topsoil to the wind in 6 falls, while the county's bar ditches blackened with the best of its ground. She was, by any honest ledger, the soundest dryland farmer in 3 townships. And she was the one the cafe still called the woman who quit plowing. She closed the book on the figures and waited for the weather, because the weather was the only argument left to her now. And the weather, sooner or later, always comes to the dry country. The dry year arrived in 1977, and it did not arrive gently. The fall and winter rains failed, and by the 3rd week of March, a hard, hot, dust-dry wind came up out of the southwest and would not lay down, day after day, the kind of wind the old people on the high plains had not felt set in like that since the dirty 30s. The subsoil was empty on every clean-worked place. The bare summer fallow that should have caught the spring rain lay open and powdered dry, with nothing on top to hold it. By the morning of March 24th, the wind was running 30 and 40 miles an hour, and the bare plowed fields of Hodgeman County were lifting into the air, brown at first and then black. The finest topsoil rolling off the worked fallow in clouds that closed the section roads and stood the streetlights on at noon in Jetmore. Laverne Tice watched a quarter of his clean-tilled fallow walk off the place in a single afternoon and pile 4 feet deep in his fence line, cutting the young wheat off at the ground with flying grit and burying what it cut. A plowed field in that wind was a loaded gun. Dwight Forsythe's 2,000 bared acres gave up their topsoil by the ton. A wheat plant cut off and buried in March does not make a crop in June. The county's winter wheat blew out or smothered across thousands of acres, and the men who had plowed clean watched the best dirt their grandfathers broke go north on the wind. The selling of plowed-out farms began before the wind quit. Vesta Halloran's wheat farm, that same dry spring, was the strangest sight in 3 townships. Her ground lay still. It breathed easy under its straw while the county choked. The standing stubble broke the wind at the surface, so the soil never lifted. The roots held the crumbs so it never powdered. What little moisture the dry winter had given lay banked under the trash where the bare fields had baked theirs away. Her young wheat stood anchored and green, while 2 miles in every direction the air was full of her neighbors' farms. The wind could not get under a field held down by its own straw, and her ground never blew, never drifted, never cut its crop off at the knees. When the dust laid down that summer, and the buyers and bankers went looking through a county of blown-out fields for a sound crop, they found exactly one worth the name, the Halloran Place, where Vesta and the hired man Emmett Brower cut hard red winter wheat off ground that had held 28 bushels to the acre, while the plowed neighbors averaged 6, and many cut nothing. Word travels in Hodgeman County. The son came first. He came on a Tuesday evening at the end of June. Royal Forsythe's boy, Travis Forsythe, 28, his cap held against his chest, and stood at the field edge the way his father had 6 years before. "Mrs. Halloran," he said, "my father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here. I've watched your ground all spring from our line, and ours blew clean to the fences, and yours never moved a grain. I came to ask if you'd sell me some of that turkey red seed and teach me to run the blade and quit the plow." Vesta looked a long moment at the boy of the man who had wanted her ground, asking to learn the thing the cafe had laughed at. She did not gloat. She named her price. She named it the way she set down every figure in the book, plain and exact. Cleaned, certified hard red winter seed wheat off her own holding ground, $6.25 the bushel. Minimum order. of 40 bushels. One on-the-ground consultation included with an order of 40 or more. She would walk his fields once and lay out the system. The undercut, the blade depth, the drilling straight through the trash. After that, $8 an hour, and she would not come during her own harvest. Travis wrote it on a feed store envelope and asked if she would write the working of the ground down too. Vesta took a clean sheet and copied out the one cross-section that mattered, and at the bottom wrote the line her grandmother had underlined twice, and the English line she had added the summer she learned it the hard way. Then she signed it Vesta Halloran, Cooperator F, and almost smiled. Travis Forsythe was the first of many. Through the summer and fall of 1977, they came up the gravel road one truck at a time. Laverne Tice, who had asked whether she meant to harvest the weeds, Harold Coons, who had warned her the wheat would rot in the trash, wheat men from 2 counties over who had read Cooperator F, and finally put the name to the woman. Vesta sold her cleaned seed wheat by the truckload, walked a dozen farms at $8 an hour to lay out their stubble systems, and made Emmett Brower her foreman. The woman who quit plowing was now the person every dryland farmer in 3 counties needed. It was that fall, with the dust barely settled, that the torn page in the book finally closed. A cousin's letter came from the Volga German settlements in Rush County. With what the old one still knew, there had been a year on the steppe above Saratov, 1921, the year of the great famine on the Volga, when Augusta's own people who had stayed plowed their ground clean and black the new modern way the city men taught, and when the dry wind came, the bared topsoil lifted off in black blizzards and buried the seed, and the family that stayed starved that winter, 2 of the children among the dead. Augusta had written the entry the night the news reached Kansas and torn it out and scorched the stub, unable to bear keeping the record of the kin who lost everything to the wind for abandoning the old fallow. And on the surviving page written the lesson plainly so it need never be made again. Keep the stubble. The very thing the cafe called laziness was the scar a black blizzard had burned into her family 60 years before, and the wind of 1977 had just written it across Hodgman County. Vesta tucked the letter into the book at the torn place. So the gap was no longer a wound, but a closed account. Dwight Forsythe came last, in October, when the blown-out farms were selling at a loss on every place but hers. He came up the lane on foot, an old proud man, and stood at the field edge with his hat against his chest the way his brother and nephew had. "I am asking your forgiveness, Vesta," he said. "I called your ground a weed patch for 6 years. I would like to come one Saturday afternoon a season and learn what I should have learned in 1971. Vesta looked at the man whose 2,000 bared acres the wind had nearly carried off, and did not make him stand in it. "You were forgiven, Dwight," she said, "on the night Matilda Forsythe sent Royal over here in 71. Come Saturday. Bring the boy." Dwight came every season after that until he died in 1985, and in his obituary his family asked that the field road along the south line of his place be known by his name. The local paper found her that winter. The Jetmore Republican ran 18 column inches on the front of its farm page in November of 1977 under a photograph of Vesta at the field edge with a fistful of standing stubble and the field book, headlined "The Widow Whose Ground Would Not Blow." The reporter quoted Dr. Reuben Falk of Kansas State University, who said the Halloran place was the best demonstration of stubble mulch moisture conservation he had documented in 15 years, studied as Cooperator F until she let her name be used. The paper quoted Dwight Forsythe, who said only that being wrong before a whole county was the cheapest tuition he ever paid. That February, she read her grandmother's 2 lines from the field book to 200 dryland men at the Dodge City wheat meeting, who did not laugh once. She farmed the place 14 more years and died in 1991 in the limestone farmhouse where her grandmother had taught her, 78 years old, the field book on the table beside her bed. She left the 1,120 acres and the book to Emmett Brower, the nearest thing to a son she had on one written condition, that he keep the book going in his own hand under hers and Augusta's. The method never invented and never owned, only remembered. Emmett farms the Halloran place still, in standing stubble across every section, and he has never once hitched a moldboard plow. On the last evening of her last summer, the light going down amber over the flat Hodgman County ground, and the first stars coming up over the windbreak, a section of hard red winter wheat, standing anchored and gold in the stubble she had left unplowed 20 summers before. Vesta Halloran sat on the tailgate of the old Ford truck with the cracked tan leather field book open on her knee. She turned to her grandmother's cross-section drawing. The standing stubble, the held crumb, the banked water, the little marks of the wheat, and ran a broad, weathered thumb down the German line and the English line beneath it. She had been 58 the fall the county laughed. She was 74 now, and the county was not laughing. The reason her ground held had never been hidden. It had been sitting in a leather book since the Volga, waiting for a granddaughter to carry it. A method is not magic. It is only memory that somebody troubled to write down. If this was one of those stories, and Hodgman County had more than one, then leave a comment telling us what your own grandmother knew that the whole town swore was foolish, and subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America, and we are working through them one harvest at a time.